Why is there a sealed panel inside a dryer that hasn't worked for decades? And why does it feel like someone wanted it to stay hidden forever? Eleanor Hayes stood in the cold shadow of a condemned laundromat, her 70-year-old hands gripping a rusted deed she barely understood. She had been evicted just 3 days earlier, left with nothing but a few bills and a memory of a house that no longer belonged to her. And now, she was the owner of this abandoned place for $12, where one broken dryer hummed like it remembered something it was never supposed to reveal. 3 days earlier, Eleanor was still sitting on the edge of a narrow motel bed, staring at an eviction notice folded into perfect squares on the cheap plastic table beside her. The room smelled faintly of bleach and old carpet, the kind of clean that never reached the air. Her husband's photograph sat upright against the lamp, slightly tilted, as if even he couldn't bear to look straight ahead. Outside, the town was already moving on without her. Inside, she counted what was left. A small purse with $73, a pill bottle rattling with arthritis medication, and a folded key she no longer knew what it opened. That morning, she had walked into the county auction with a wool coat that had lost half its buttons. The room was filled with younger buyers in clean boots and confident voices, people who spoke about properties like they were numbers on a screen. Eleanor stayed at the back, her fingers tightening around a paper cup of vending machine coffee that had already gone cold. When the laundromat was announced, closed for years, machines frozen in time, roof partially leaking, someone behind her laughed softly. That place should have been bulldozed a decade ago. No one raised a hand when the price dropped to $12. So she did. The clerk slid the deed across the table like it was already dust. Eleanor signed her name slowly, carefully, as if signing too fast might make the decision disappear. Outside, the wind cut through her coat as she stood in the parking lot, holding the folded property papers against her chest. There was no applause, no congratulations, just the sound of cars leaving and the faint echo of something she couldn't name yet. Now she stood in front of the laundromat. The glass door resisted when she pushed it open, releasing a breath of stale air that smelled like wet metal and forgotten detergent. Inside, the ceiling lights flickered once, then held. Rows of machines lined the walls like abandoned soldiers. Dust covered every surface, thick enough that her footsteps left soft, gray prints across the floor tiles. Somewhere deeper inside, a single dryer sat slightly apart from the others, its front panel warped, its coin slot rusted shut. Eleanor moved slowly, touching nothing more than she had to. She had fixed enough broken things in her life to recognize when something was broken beyond repair, and when something was pretending to be. The dryer's drum didn't turn when she tested it. But when her hand brushed the side panel, she felt it. A faint vibration, almost like a heartbeat trapped inside metal. She paused. The sound stopped, then started again, softer this time, as if responding to her presence. Eleanor knelt, her knees aching as she traced the edge of the machine. That was when she noticed it. 2 screws on the lower panel that didn't match the rest. Newer, replaced, too clean for a machine that had been abandoned for years. Her fingers hesitated for only a moment before she reached for a screwdriver left behind on a nearby folding cart. And as the first screw loosened with a reluctant metallic whisper, something shifted deep inside the dryer. Something that should not have moved at all. The screw finally gave way with a dry metallic sigh, and as Eleanor Hayes slowly lifted the loosened panel, the air inside the laundromat seemed to change temperature. A hollow cavity yawned behind the dryer's metal shell, too clean for something that should have been abandoned for years. Inside, she didn't see dust or dead wiring. She saw a sealed shape wrapped in oilcloth, edges pressed tight as if someone had forced it to survive time itself. Her breath caught, but before she could reach in, the memory of everything she had lost pressed harder than the weight of the machine in front of her. 3 days earlier still felt like yesterday in a way that made her mornings heavier than her nights. Eleanor sat at a chipped kitchen table in a temporary rental unit, the kind of place that smelled faintly of bleach and old would no matter how often you opened the windows. On the table, a final eviction notice lay beside a stack of unpaid bills. Electricity past due by 14 days, water marked for shutoff within the week. The numbers blurred together, But one line stayed sharp. Balance due $1,942.63. It might as well have been a different language. Her husband's absence was louder than any sound in the room. His chair still sat pushed in slightly crooked, like he had left it mid-motion and never returned. The hospital bracelet from his final days rested inside a small plastic box on the shelf, something she couldn't throw away but couldn't touch either. She had spent 43 years in the same house, and now she was being told she no longer belonged anywhere in it. The letter from the landlord had arrived folded into perfect thirds, as if precision could soften cruelty. Property repossession due to unpaid transition lease terms. No moustion, no hesitation. Just instructions for leaving. That morning, she had counted her life in objects. $73 in cash folded inside an envelope labeled groceries, a pharmacy receipt for medication she had not yet purchased, and a faded bank statement showing $211.08 remaining in her account. The numbers were small enough to feel insulting. Still, she folded them back into her purse carefully, as if order could protect dignity. When she arrived at the courthouse auction, the parking lot was already full of vehicles she could never afford to repair, let alone replace. Inside, the air smelled like polished wood and quiet authority. People spoke in shorthand: investment, redevelopment, flip potential. Words that sounded like they belonged to a different life entirely. Eleanor stayed near the back, her coat buttoned all the way up even though the room was warm. When the laundromat listing appeared on the board, someone behind her snorted softly. "That place is a liability," a man muttered, scrolling through something on his phone. "Not even worth demolition costs." She didn't argue. She simply looked at the paper in front of her. Parcel 18B. Closed laundromat. Equipment non-functional. Utilities disconnected. Minimum bid, $12. $12. It was less than the cost of her medication copay. Less than the gas she no longer used. Less than the dignity she felt she had already been forced to spend. When the auctioneer asked for bids, the silence stretched longer than it should have. A cough, a chair shifting, a faint laugh that died too quickly. Eleanor raised her hand once. No one challenged her. The clerk slid the deed across the counter without looking up. Her name appeared in black ink, slightly misaligned as if the printer itself had hesitated. But something else caught her eye as she turned the paper slightly under the fluorescent light. A handwritten correction in the margin, recent enough that the ink hadn't fully settled. Parcel note. A secondary annotation. Something about restricted equipment access. The clerk followed her gaze for a brief second too long before quickly looking away. "Old maintenance issue," she said flatly, already reaching for the next file. But Eleanor had already seen enough to notice what others ignored. The laundromat wasn't just abandoned. It had been marked, and the name written next to the dryer unit code had been crossed out and rewritten. Twice. The moment Eleanor Hayes accepted the deed, it felt less like ownership and more like a sentence she didn't fully understand yet. The paper was warm from the clerk's printer, edges curling slightly as if even it wanted to reject what it represented. Parcel 18B. Closed laundromat. $12. A transaction so small it felt almost insulting, yet heavy enough to sit deep in her chest as she folded it once and placed it carefully inside her coat pocket. Behind her, the auction room had already moved on to louder, cleaner things. Properties with potential, investors with plans, numbers that made sense to people who still had options. No one clapped. No one looked impressed. A man in a gray suit leaned toward another and muttered, "That place is a liability." The words weren't meant for her, but they landed anyway. Someone else added without looking up. From his phone, "It's been dead for years. Probably cheaper to tear it down than unlock it." Eleanor didn't respond. She simply adjusted the strap of her worn leather purse and stood up slowly, as if rushing would somehow validate their dismissal. Her knees ached as she walked toward the clerk's desk, where the woman slid a second page across the counter. A county map printout with faint red markings. A small circle surrounded the laundromat's parcel, but there was something else. A second notation in pen, darker, almost hurried. Restricted access equipment zone. The clerk noticed her looking and immediately cleared her throat. "Old record mistake," she said too quickly, already stacking the next file. But her fingers hesitated for half a second longer than necessary before letting go of the paper. Eleanor folded the map anyway. Outside, the air felt colder than it should have for early spring. Her car, a 2003 sedan with a failing heater, coughed twice before starting. The dashboard light blinked like a warning she had stopped respecting years ago. She sat there for a moment with the deed resting on the passenger seat. The words "sold as is" printed in bold ink that felt heavier every time she looked at it. 3 days earlier, she would have called this impossible. A joke. A mistake made by a woman who should have known better than to gamble her last remaining dignity on abandoned buildings. But 3 days earlier, she had also believed she still had time. Now, she had $211 left in her bank account, a prescription she hadn't filled, and a motel bill due in 5 days. The eviction notice had already been processed. Her name had already been erased from the house she lived in for 43 years. There was nothing left to protect except the small, stubborn refusal to disappear quietly. The laundromat sat 12 minutes outside town. When she arrived, the sign was barely readable. Faded blue letters hanging crooked above a cracked glass door. Open had long been painted over, but the outline still lingered like a memory that refused to die. Someone had once tried to fix the parking lot. The asphalt showed patches of newer black against old fractures like scars. Stitched too late. Eleanor parked slowly, gripping the wheel longer than necessary. No one else was there. No movement. No sound except the distant hum of a highway that pretended this place didn't exist. She stepped out holding the deed in one hand and the small brass key the clerk had handed her in the other. It was lighter than expected, almost fragile, as if it didn't belong to something real. The lock resisted when she tried it. Not broken. Not stuck. Wrong. She turned it again, slower this time, feeling the faintest metallic hesitation inside the mechanism. Like something inside the door was waiting to decide whether it should open for her or not. Behind her, a passing car slowed for just a second as it drove by. The driver glanced at her standing alone in front of a building everyone else had already written off. Then it moved on. Eleanor held the key still in the lock, unaware that whatever she had just agreed to own had already been waiting for her far longer than anyone in town would ever admit. Eleanor pushed the heavy glass door, and it groaned in protest, the lock rattling against its corroded frame. Dust billowed in soft clouds, curling in the thin shafts of sunlight that cut through cracked windows. The smell of stale detergent and oil-slicked metal clung to every surface, mingling with the faint sweetness of mold creeping along the baseboards. She stepped inside, her worn shoes scraping against the warped vinyl tiles, each floorboard sighing under her weight as if protesting her presence. A calendar hung crooked on the wall, frozen on August 2009, its edges curling and stained, a long-forgotten rhythm of days and months. She placed her small cardboard box of belongings on the counter, the surface thick with a layer of gray dust that lifted in quiet clouds when her fingers brushed it. Beneath the counter, the register drawer remained chained shut, the metal dulled and scratched, letters engraved years ago faded but still readable. Eleanor ran her hand along the edge, feeling indentations from someone else's hands, worn smooth over decades. A few folding chairs lined the back wall, their vinyl seats cracked and torn, springs poking through. One chair tilted slightly as if recently vacated. She pulled her coat tighter around her, settling into a corner with the faint hope of making this place temporarily her own. Checking the dead electrical outlets, counting the few cans of soup she had tucked in a small bag, and testing a flashlight that cast a thin cone across the shadowed walls. Somewhere near the back, an old locker leaned against a wall, dented and rusted, the padlock missing, revealing a hollow, dark interior. Eleanor's eyes lingered on the seams, noticing one side of the wall panel seemed newer, the paint slightly glossier, uneven against the rest of the peeling surface. She crouched to listen, tilting her head near the baseboards, and caught a faint hollow tap, a sound too deliberate to be wind or settling wood. Her heart thudded as she straightened, hand brushing the counter again, and her eyes caught the corner where the dryer sat. Its exterior worn and dull, but a faint line along the side hinted at a panel that had been tampered with, its edges sharper than the surrounding rust. Eleanor let her breath out slowly, the quiet hum of the town outside pressing against the broken glass, and she realized, for the first time, that though the place had been abandoned for years, it was not entirely empty. Something, or someone, had left a trace waiting for her to notice. Eleanor rolled up her sleeves and grabbed the broom, the bristles scraping against the grimy tiles as dust motes swirled in the shafts of morning light. Her hands were cracked and red, knuckles raw from twisting the old mop handle, but she moved with the precision of someone who had spent decades caring for others, cleaning up spills, wiping counters, making order out of chaos. The glass panes along the front were spattered and cracked. She knelt, carefully lifting fragments with gloved fingers, setting them aside in a cardboard box that smelled faintly of mildew. Outside, rain tapped against the tin roof in an uneven rhythm, a soft percussion that mingled with the groan of loose floorboards beneath her weight. Eleanor dragged a tarp across a leak in the ceiling, securing it with duct tape and a wobbling chair to hold it in place, testing each corner until the water no longer splashed on the counter. Her knees ached, and a dull throbbing pulsed from her lower back, but she paused only to sip lukewarm water from a thermos she had brought, noting the overdue electricity bill in her coat pocket that she could barely afford to pay. She replaced a dead bulb above the folding counter, the dim fluorescent flickering to life with a sputter, and wiped the surface clean with a rag that left streaks of gray dust behind, revealing a faint engraving along the edge, a name partially scratched out and replaced with someone else's in hurried handwriting. Eleanor frowned, leaning closer to read it. Her thumb brushed a small brass key that had fallen from a drawer she had just opened, one she thought had been empty. It didn't match any lock she had yet, and for a moment she imagined it had been misplaced long ago. The receipt crumpled under the counter caught her eye next, a faded print with a stranger's name stamped neatly across it, old enough to be years but fresh enough to suggest a visit long after the laundromat's closure. She set it aside, shaking her head as if the paper were a mistake, and returned to sweeping, stacking the chairs neatly, testing each outlet with a flashlight to see if it still carried current. The sound of her broom bristles across the tile became a rhythm, a heartbeat, the only sound in the abandoned room besides the rain and the occasional creak from the roof. Eleanor paused at the doorway, leaning against the frame, noticing a section of the floor had been replaced more recently, planks lighter and smoother than the rest, and the edges didn't align perfectly. She knelt to examine it, the smell of fresh sawdust faint beneath the layers of dust, and as her fingers traced the seam, something underneath shifted, a soft, metallic clink that made her freeze. Her heart picked up pace. It was too deliberate to be a loose nail. Eleanor leaned closer, brushing aside more dust with her hand, realizing with a chill that her cleaning, her work to restore order, had just exposed the first tangible sign that the laundromat was hiding more than decay. Something long forgotten was waiting here, buried beneath years of dust and the effort to survive. The sound of metal shifting under the floor made Eleanor freeze with her hands still pressed against the dusty plank. Her breath held so tightly it hurt. For a moment, even the rain on the tin roof seemed to pause, as if the building itself was listening. Then came a knock at the front door. Soft, deliberate, nothing like the wind. Eleanor straightened slowly, brushing dust from her knees, her fingers still trembling from what she had just felt beneath the floorboards. When she opened the door, a man stood there holding a small paper bag and a rusted toolbox, his coat soaked from the drizzle. "I saw the light on," he said simply, lifting the bag slightly. "Didn't think anyone had electricity running in here anymore." He was older, maybe late 60s, with work-worn hands and a cap that read Harper Hardware, since 1978. His eyes moved past her shoulder, taking in the half-restored chaos inside. The tarp over the ceiling leak, the stacked chairs, the faint glow of the single working bulb. Then his gaze settled on her face, and softened in a way that made her feel unexpectedly seen. "You must be Eleanor," he added. "Frank mentioned someone finally took the place." Eleanor hesitated. "Frank?" The man gave a short nod, stepping just inside without waiting for permission, like the building itself still allowed him. "Frank Miller. Used to run deliveries here." Back when your husband... He stopped, just long enough for the air to change. Back when he was still keeping this place alive. At the mention of her husband, Eleanor instinctively tightened her grip on the doorframe. You knew him? A faint smile crossed the man's face, but it didn't reach his eyes fully. Everybody here did. Hard to forget someone who fixed your truck at midnight without charging you. Or who showed up after the flood with a pump and no questions asked. He placed the paper bag on the counter. Inside were 2 coffees and a sealed container of screws, nails, and a small flashlight battery pack. Not much, but in that moment it felt like more than kindness, it felt like recognition. Eleanor watched him closely. Why does everyone talk about him like that? Like he was still here? The man paused, glancing toward the back of the laundromat where the floorboards had shifted earlier. Something in his posture tightened slightly, like a memory brushing too close. Because some people don't leave cleanly, he said. They leave things behind for others to stand on. He walked over to the counter and, without asking, picked up the small brass key Eleanor had found earlier. He turned it between his fingers once, then looked at her sharply. Where did you get this? In a drawer, she replied. It doesn't fit anything I've found yet. He exhaled through his nose, almost like a laugh that never fully formed. That key shouldn't even be here anymore. Eleanor stepped closer. Why? The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out something folded. An old receipt, edges yellowed, stamped from Harper Hardware dated nearly 20 years ago. Eleanor's eyes caught the signature at the bottom before she even understood why it mattered. Her husband's name, written in ink that had faded but not disappeared. You're standing in something that was never just a laundromat, he finally said quietly. And that floorboard you're worried about, it's not the first thing that was hidden here. His gaze lifted to meet hers, steady and unflinching. Then he placed the key back into her hand, closing her fingers around it gently. Your husband didn't build this place for washing clothes, he said. He built it for what people needed to forget. Eleanor stood still as the weight of those words settled into the quiet hum of the building, and when she looked back toward the warped floorboards, she noticed something new. Someone had already marked where to stand next. The brass key turned slightly in Eleanor's hand as she stood still, listening to the laundromat breathe around her. Old with settling, rain tapping the tin roof, something deeper ticking behind the walls like a memory refusing to die. The hardware man's words still hung in the air, built for what people needed to forget. But now, forgetfulness didn't feel accidental anymore. Felt arranged. She walked slowly toward the back of the laundromat, where the floorboards had shifted earlier under her hand. The tarp over the ceiling leak fluttered slightly with a draft she couldn't locate. Each step made the vinyl tiles complain, uneven under her weight, until she reached the warped section again. Kneeling, she pressed her palm flat. The wood there was newer, smoother, tighter, almost too precise compared to the rest of the decayed floor. She tapped it once. A hollow echo answered. Not loud, controlled, intentional. Eleanor exhaled slowly and moved to the nearest wall, lifting her flashlight. The beam swept across peeling paint until she noticed it. One section of wall, near the old dryer unit, where the color didn't match. The paint was slightly newer, layered over older tones like someone had tried to erase a boundary but didn't finish the job. She pressed her knuckles against it. Solid until the sound shifted halfway down. A dull, empty thud. Behind her, the rain grew heavier, drumming against the roof like distant footsteps. She moved to the rusted locker Frank had mentioned. It leaned at a strange angle, bolts on one side newer than the other, as if it had been reattached after being removed. Eleanor pulled at it carefully. It didn't budge. But when she ran her fingers along the back edge, she felt it. An uneven seam where metal didn't quite meet concrete. Someone rebuilt this wall, she whispered without meaning to. She tried the screwdriver the hardware man had left behind. One screw came loose too easily, almost freshly tightened, and dropped to the floor with a sharp metallic ping that echoed longer than it should have. Eleanor paused, listening. For a second, she thought she heard something respond from inside the wall. A faint shift, like something settling into place. She turned back toward the dryer. The panel she had noticed before now seemed more obvious, its outline clearer under the flickering light. A thin gap ran along its edge, barely visible unless the light hit it just right. She moved closer, dragging a chair over to stand on it, steadying herself with one hand against the machine. That's when she saw the wire. A thin electrical line, too new for the rest of the building, ran behind the dryer and disappeared into the wall. Not toward any outlet, not toward any visible junction box. It simply went inward, as if the wall itself was feeding on it. Eleanor followed it with her eyes. It led to a point behind the newly painted section. Her pulse tightened. She stepped down carefully, circling the wall again, this time noticing something she had missed before. A faint rectangle outline beneath the paint, like a door sealed and erased rather than built over. At the top corner of the shape, barely visible under the light, there was a small indentation. Too precise to be damage, too intentional to be random. Keyhole. Not for the brass key in her hand. Something larger, older, hidden on purpose. Outside, a car slowed on the road, tires crunching gravel, then paused just long enough for headlights to sweep across the broken front window before moving on. Eleanor didn't look away from the wall. Her fingers tightened around the key as she stepped closer to the faint outline, realizing for the first time that the laundromat wasn't just hiding something. It had been built around it, and the edge of what had been sealed away was finally beginning to show itself clearly beneath the paint. Eleanor's hands shook slightly as she fitted the brass key into the small indentation at the top of the panel, pressing and twisting until the metal edge shivered and a faint click echoed inside the wall cavity. She lowered herself onto the dusty floor, flashlight in one hand, the other tracing the seam she had discovered days earlier. With a flathead screwdriver, she began to gently pry the panel open, revealing a hollow space lined with plywood, the interior smelling faintly of machine oil and aged paper. Nestled inside was a small, rectangular metal box, its surface dulled by years of dust and oxidation, the corners slightly bent, and a tiny lock stamped with her husband's initials. H. Eleanor exhaled slowly, pressing a fingertip against the cold metal before finding the tiny clasp and lifting it carefully. Inside was a folded envelope, edges yellowed and fragile, tied with a thin string that smelled faintly of cedar and mildew. She unfolded it slowly on the floor, the paper crinkling under her touch, revealing a handwritten note in familiar, slightly shaky handwriting. The date was 15 years ago, yet the address listed matched this laundromat's old property lines, and the numbers on the ledger referenced sums she recognized from past bills her husband had secretly paid. Eleanor pressed a hand to her chest, forcing herself to sit upright as the rain tapped a quiet rhythm against the roof, her mind racing with the first tiny answers. One page showed a name she knew, her husband's old friend Frank Miller, mentioned in relation to a deposit account and an envelope that had apparently been delivered years earlier. The next page listed a small sum of money repeated multiple times, each entry corresponding to years she had thought lost, and beneath it a signature that had been slightly altered, as if corrected to obscure or redirect ownership. Eleanor's breath hitched as she realized that each line raised more questions than it answered. Why had her husband recorded these deposits this way? Who else knew of them? And why hide them inside a laundromat dryer panel? She folded the envelope with care, slipped it inside her coat, and dialed the number Frank had left with her when he brought the coffee days ago. But the line went to voicemail. She tucked the envelope under her arm, resting it close to her chest, aware that she was the first person in years to touch it. The final detail that froze her in place was a small photograph pressed into the envelope, a faded Polaroid of her husband smiling at the laundromat, a young child leaning against the counter, and a shadowy figure in the back whose face she didn't recognize, but whose posture mirrored someone standing behind her now. On the corner of the photo, written in the same shaky hand as the note, was a name and a date. Eleanor Hayes, 2005. Eleanor sank onto the dusty floor, the envelope of papers pressed against her knees, and traced the lines of ink with fingertips stiff from days of cleaning and lifting. The handwriting wavered in familiar arcs, letters curling like the smoke from a pipe her husband once smoked in the kitchen, a scent she could almost remember. She unfolded a folded ledger, the edges yellowed, corners frayed, and saw rows of names she recognized. Neighbors, strangers, families she'd passed by without thought. All marked with sums and dates, payments her husband had quietly made to cover rent, medicine, school books, even a tiny heating bill for a widow down the street. She lifted a Polaroid tucked between pages. It showed him handing a grocery bag to a child in a soaked coat outside the laundromat. The child's face blurred by movement, but the expression unmistakably relieved. Eleanor's hand trembled as she compared it to the receipt she had found earlier with Frank Miller's name stamped neatly along the margin. The same ledger referenced the same sums, her husband's initials beside each entry. She ran a fingertip over the numbers, realizing the pattern was deliberate, consistent over years, and yet hidden from all but the quietest eyes. A letter, folded tight, fell from between two pages. Unopened, it smelled faintly of cedar and soap, the paper brittle. The note inside mentioned a property deed, different from the one she had just signed, but attached with instructions in careful script, to be revealed only if she survived the losses he had always feared. Eleanor's breath caught, the weight of decades pressing down, and she understood that her husband had kept watch over the town and over her in ways she never imagined. Securing houses for families in crisis, paying bills he didn't need to, recording truths about the land and its people he alone could protect. She glanced at the ledger again, noticing a name faintly crossed out, another name written beside it, Lawrence Hargrove, the developer her husband had always warned about, the one who might have claimed everything if he knew. The flood of realization made her stomach tighten. Someone had actively tried to erase the work he had done, and yet, each careful note, each hidden envelope, each meticulous entry led inexorably back to her. She pressed the Polaroid against her chest, inhaling the faint smell of cedar and old paper, and in the quiet hum of the abandoned laundromat, with rain pattering softly on the tin roof, she understood something chilling and profound. Her husband had not forgotten her. He had built a path, layer by layer, for her to uncover a truth no one else dared touch, and the next step was waiting, deliberately, for her to follow. Eleanor could still feel the weight of the ledger in her hands when the first undeniable fracture appeared in what she thought was just forgotten history. She sat on the cracked wooden floor of the laundromat, the envelope spread open beside her, as she carefully aligned the faded Polaroid with the handwritten entries in the ledger. Every name, every payment, every quiet act of intervention her husband had recorded seemed to converge on one repeated notation. Parcel 18B, Laundromat Corridor, County Amendment File 4471. The same number echoed again and again, but this time it was not just charity, it was ownership. Conditional ownership. Protected interest. A line in the ledger referenced a trust account she had never heard of, established under a name she barely recognized. Eleanor Hayes Revocable Protection Trust, dated 23 years earlier. Her breath caught as she whispered it aloud, testing whether it was real or just another mistake hidden in ink. The hardware man's receipt she had kept folded in her coat suddenly made sense. The repeated signatures matched a county filing stamp she had seen on the deed. She forced herself to stand, grabbing her coat and stepping into the damp air outside, the laundromat key still cold in her palm. Within an hour, she was at the county records office, the smell of paper and toner thick in the fluorescent-lit halls. A clerk pulled up the parcel history after too many pauses, her expression tightening slightly as she scanned the screen. "This file, it's been amended multiple times," she said carefully, "and there's a restricted addendum tied to mineral and substructure rights beneath the property." Eleanor blinked. "Mineral rights?" she repeated, the word feeling foreign in her mouth. The clerk hesitated too long before nodding. "It's not just a laundromat. It never was." Back in the laundromat that evening, rain heavier now, Eleanor unfolded a second document from the envelope, a bank record confirming a dormant account, linked to the same parcel number, frozen under legal dispute status. The numbers were small at first glance, but the annotations beside them told a different story. Transferred assets, redirected ownership, and a final line marked in handwriting she now recognized without doubt, her husband's. The implication tightened in her chest. This was not abandoned property. This was controlled, protected, and quietly fought over for years. Her phone rang abruptly, breaking the silence. Unknown number. She didn't answer. Through the cracked glass, she saw a truck slow outside the laundromat, idling longer than necessary before moving on. When she looked back down at the ledger, a shadow fell across the page. Frank Miller had returned, his face unusually tense. "You've been to the county office," he said quietly, not as a question but a warning. "That file shouldn't still be accessible." Eleanor lifted her eyes. "It belongs to him," she said, tapping the ledger. Frank shook his head once, sharply. "It belongs to whoever controls the amendment. And that's exactly why people are going to come looking for it." As if answering him, a second vehicle slowed outside. Sleek, unfamiliar, and far too clean for this part of town. Frank's voice dropped lower. "They already know it's active again." Eleanor looked down at the ledger, at the trust account bearing her name, at the parcel number repeated like a pulse beneath every line. And for the first time, she understood that what she thought was a forgotten laundromat had just been recognized by someone who would never let it stay forgotten. The rain had not stopped when Eleanor saw the second car pull up again, its headlights cutting across the laundromat floor like a scalpel through dust. Frank Miller didn't move this time. He just stood near the ledger table, his jaw tight, as if he already knew what was coming. Eleanor kept the documents pressed against her chest when the door opened and two men stepped in. One in a tailored suit too clean for the weather, the other carrying a leather folder stamped with county seals. The man in front introduced himself calmly, voice smooth enough to feel rehearsed. "Mrs. Hayes, I'm Daniel Mercer, legal counsel representing interest in Parcel 18B and its associated filings." He didn't look at her long. His eyes went straight to the ledger on the table. "There appears to be an active dispute regarding ownership and valuation." He placed a document on the counter. Purchase agreement. A number was already filled in, far higher than anything Eleanor had ever held in her life. "Given recent reassessments," he continued, sliding another paper forward, "the property is now classified as commercially and structurally valuable. We are prepared to offer you compensation immediately. This avoids unnecessary legal complications." Frank let out a short, humorless breath. "Complications," he muttered under his breath. Eleanor didn't touch the papers. "This was abandoned for years," she said quietly. "No one wanted it." The second man finally spoke, voice lower, more clinical. "That is no longer accurate. There are code violations that must be addressed, structural anomalies, and unresolved financial liens tied to historical filings. For public safety, the site may need to be secured pending resolution." The word secured hung in the air longer than anything else. Daniel slid another sheet closer. "Frankly, Mrs. Hayes, continuing this alone is not advisable. There are signatures here that require verification. Some appear inconsistent with county standards." Frank stepped forward immediately. "That's not what those files say." He cut in, but his voice carried something tighter now, fear, not anger. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the ledger. She opened it on the counter and turned it toward them, tapping the trust entry with a steady hand. "My name is on this." A brief silence followed. The suited man glanced down, then away too quickly. "That trust," he said carefully, "may have been created under conditions that are no longer valid. There are concerns about authorization and intent. We're simply trying to prevent a legal misunderstanding from escalating." A misunderstanding. The word felt too light for what was happening. Eleanor stepped back, pulling the envelope of documents closer to her chest. Her hands shook slightly, but her voice didn't. "You called it abandoned until yesterday," she said. "Now it's suddenly unsafe and valuable?" No one answered directly. Instead, Daniel placed a final document on the counter. A deadline notice. 48 hours to respond before administrative action. Beneath it, a faint photocopy of a deed, blurred, partial, but unmistakably bearing a second signature Eleanor had never seen before. Not her husband's. Frank noticed it too. His eyes narrowed. "That copy shouldn't exist," he said quietly. The suited man finally looked at him. "Records are being reconciled," he replied. "Sometimes older documents surface during reassessment." Eleanor slipped her phone from her pocket and took a photo of every page without asking. The click of the camera felt louder than any argument. She folded the original ledger and tucked it into her coat lining, pressing it flat against her side. As the men turned to leave, Daniel paused at the door. "Mrs. Hayes," he said politely, "we recommend you do not engage in any further modifications to the property until ownership is formally resolved. It would be unfortunate to proceed incorrectly." When the door closed behind them, the silence returned heavier than before. Frank looked at her, voice lower now. "They're not here for paperwork anymore." Eleanor didn't answer immediately. She stared at the copy deed still on the counter, the faint second signature barely visible under the smudge of ink. And as she picked it up for a final look, she noticed something printed in the margin that had not been there before. An audit timestamp from a county camera system, dated just 2 nights ago, showing someone inside the laundromat before she ever opened the panel. And the name attached to the log entry made her stomach drop because it was a witness who had already signed against her once before. The small conference room smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper as Eleanor stepped in, the ledger and envelope pressed carefully against her chest. Around the table sat the developer, 2 lawyers, and a county clerk, their faces polished but tense, papers spread neatly before them. Eleanor placed the envelope down first, letting the weight of it settle on the table. Even the rustling of its contents seemed to command attention. She opened the ledger slowly, turning to the page that listed parcel 18B and the trust account bearing her name. The numbers, written meticulously over the years, aligned perfectly with the bank letter she had brought, each deposit, each small expenditure, proving consistent ownership. The room went quiet. The clerk leaned forward, eyes scanning the lines as if seeing the laundromat for the first time. One lawyer cleared his throat. "Procedurally, Mrs. Hayes, this document may not be valid. There are corrections, older signatures." Eleanor pointed to the signature next to the trust account, the ink unbroken, slightly raised on the paper. "This is my husband's handwriting. This trust was recorded, notarized, and filed. You can check the county archives. Every ledger entry matches." The developer's hand twitched over a sheet labeled Purchase Agreement. "We're only trying to help. There's structural liability here," he said, voice measured, hiding tension. Eleanor lifted the Polaroid from the envelope, placing it between them. The image of her husband handing a child a grocery bag, the laundromat in the background, stamped with the same date as the first ledger entry, forced the room to pause. "You think this is junk?" she said softly. "But it's proof. Every action, every payment, every protection he set up. It's all here. And it's meant for me." The clerk swallowed, turning a page on a microfilm reader to reveal the deed from 2005. Its county seal embossed and intact, the timestamp matching the ledger. The developer's eyes flicked to the floor as Eleanor opened the envelope with the bank letter, the faded memo instructing the trust be executed in her favor. Even the youngest lawyer stopped mid-sentence, pen hovering, as a copy of the camera log from the laundromat flicked across the projector. The image showing someone inside the building 2 nights before, corroborating the dates in the ledger. Eleanor's voice remained calm, precise. "All these documents are consistent. Any claim otherwise ignores the evidence. Every entry, every signature, every witness listed confirms ownership and intention." The room went still. One by one, papers that once controlled the discussion were now tools in her hands. The developer's smile froze. The clerk's fingers rested uncertainly above the keys. Eleanor gathered the envelope, the Polaroid, and the ledger, standing straighter than she had in years, feeling the weight of truth shift the balance. She understood in that instant that the laundromat was no longer just a building, and she was no longer powerless. The tide had turned, and the choice of what to do with what was rightfully hers rested solely in her hands. Eleanor turned the key slowly in the refurbished lock, the brass gleaming in the morning light that spilled through the cracked windows now cleaned and clear. The laundromat, once whispered about as a joke, now smelled faintly of soap and polish, a promise rather than decay. She placed the envelope, the Polaroid, and the ledger on the counter, each item now a testament, not a secret, proof of her husband's foresight and her own resilience. Outside, neighbors she had seen only in passing returned with ladders, paintbrushes, and the warm smell of coffee, offering hands and stories that had been waiting as long as the building had been abandoned. The county clerk arrived quietly, sliding over a corrected deed stamped and signed, the trust account unlocked for her, every page verified and intact. The petition challenging her ownership had been dismissed, and the developer had left town, his polite smile masking the knowledge that he could no longer contest her claim. Eleanor pinned the faded open sign back above the door, brushing dust from the edges, her fingers lingering on the engraved brass where the name of her husband had once been hidden. She placed the Polaroid in a small frame on the counter, the child's joyful face and the man's steady gaze reminding her that these walls had been a haven, a legacy of care she could now protect openly. She paused, looking at the floorboards she had repaired, the counter she had polished, the light returning to every dark corner, realizing the ledger no longer represented debt or secrecy. It was evidence that she, too, had always mattered. Finally, Eleanor stepped outside. For a breath, the morning sun warming her back, and for the first time in decades, she felt the steady solidity of a place truly hers, a home she could defend, a legacy she could share. The brass key dangling lightly from her hand like a beacon, proof that what had once been dismissed as junk was, in fact, a treasure preserved for the right person, patiently waiting to be discovered.